Welcome back to the next part in my series on the Burnley Group. I'm picking up where I left off in the early 1880s and covering the rapid expansion of the group into the late 19th and early 20th century. If you haven't watched the last part of this series, I do highly recommend you go watch it, as without it you don't have the context for what we'll explore today. 1880 marked the beginning of a new decade for the Victorian Railways. It also marked the second year that the Victorian Railways had control of the South Suburban system, and it was time to expand. The 1880 Railway Construction Act passed on the 28th of December 1880 and stipulated two new extensions of the Hawthorn line to be undertaken. The first of these, and by far the largest, was the full extension of the line from Hawthorn to Lilydale, a distance of over 32 kilometres. The residents of Camberwell and Box Hill had been campaigning for this extension for over 5 years, and as such the news of the extension was very well received. The second line funding this act branched from the Hawthorn line at East Richmond, where it would curve north, running nearly parallel to Church Street to the River Yarra, before turning west, passing through Collingwood and Clifton Hill, crossing the Yarra, turning east and terminating at the edge of the Darebin Creek in Alphington. Whilst the line to Lilydale proceeded, the branch to Alphington was cancelled before construction would commence. Works on the Lilydale extension proceeded rather quickly. This was in large part due to a request from the railways to the surveyors of the line to ensure that there was no major bridges or large deviations. One key deviation that was scrapped was the original path of the line through Camberwell, which would have followed a more southern alignment to pass closer to the Camberwell city centre at Riversdale Road. Despite following a more shallow gradient through the town, this southern deviation was abandoned as it added over a kilometre to the route and it would have likely required some significant bridges over major roads. Instead, the alignment went north of Camberwell up a rather steep gradient from Auburn. After Camberwell, the line followed rather shallow grades with no significant issues. Construction of the extension from Hawthorn to Lilydale was contracted to C&E Miller for £79,865 and 10 shillings. By completion of construction in early 1883, the total expenditure on the line was £170,251, over twice the original contracted amount. By early 1882, the extension to Camberwell was mostly ready, however station buildings on the line were not yet finished. Despite this, the line began serving passengers on April 3rd, with 4 trains each way each day. The aforementioned gradient from Auburn proved troublesome, with early steam engines unable to make it up the slope with a full consist, requiring trains to be split to make it up. Services on the line were operated by old Melbourne and Hudson's Bay United Railway Company engines, and generally consisted of 4 or 6 carriages. By June, the line to Box Hill had been completed, however it was chosen to hold off on providing services till the whole line was done. This came in December with a special train carrying important members of government, including Premier Oakleigh and Minister for Railways Thomas Benn. On opening, the line had stations at Glenferrie, Auburn, Camberwell, Canterbury, Box Hill, Ringwood, Warrandyte and Lilydale. Alongside the extension, work was being done to duplicate the line from East Richmond to Hawthorn. These works were essential to relieve congestion on the line, however, unfortunately, they would lead to the worst disaster to ever occur on the Burnley Group. On Saturday, the 2nd of December 1882, the day after the opening of the line, a special train was ran from Flinders Street to Box Hill as part of a land auction. The train left Flinders Street at 2 p.m. and consisted of locomotive R191, followed by 7 first-class carriages and a guard's van. Aboard the train there was roughly 220 passengers alongside a driver, fireman and guard. The train reached Box Hill, where the passengers disembarked and enjoyed their afternoons in the town. They would reboard 3 hours later, with the train departing Box Hill for Flinders Street at 5:55 p.m. It was scheduled to arrive in Hawthorn at 6:21 p.m, where it would pass a local train terminating at Hawthorn. At this time, Hawthorn had been duplicated, and there was 2 platforms, meaning that a train could sit at a platform and wait for another train to pass. The section of line from Hawthorn to East Richmond had also been duplicated, however at the time only the new track was being used as the old track was closed and undergoing repairs. This meant that the whole section was effectively single track. The special was scheduled to pass Hawthorn Station and by extension the local Hawthorn train as an express. The driver arrived at the station slightly early and began to slow down, aware of the single track and wanting confirmation that the line was clear. The Hawthorn station master, who also controlled the block from Burnley to Hawthorn, waved the train through, assuming it would pass the local train at Burnley. The section of track after Hawthorn Station is relatively straight over the Yarra River and to Picnic Station. However, after reaching Picnic, the line enters a deep cutting and a sharp curve to bring it parallel to Swan Street and into Burnley Station. The driver of the special reports passing Picnic and seeing the plume of the local train in the distance over the cutting. Assured by the confidence of the Hawthorn station master, the driver simply assumed that the old track had been reopened and that the trains would simply pass harmlessly. The Melbourne train was larger than the special, consisting of a newly built 440 well-tank Stephenson's locomotive, identical in design to the former company locomotives but built directly for the government in 1881. This locomotive, South Suburban number 32, was hauling 10 carriages. There was only 50 people in this train, as the majority had disembarked at Richmond. The trains collided roughly 80 metres west of the Swan Street level crossing at a relatively slow speed, owing to the local train having just stopped at Burnley and the special having slowed down due to the driver's suspicion of the plume. Just before impact, the crews of both locomotives noticed each other, and both crews were able to jump clear and avoid injury. The locomotives of both trains were severely damaged, and the first 2 carriages on both trains were destroyed, totalling to 4 carriages destroyed. By sheer luck, there were no fatalities in the incident. However, 1 man did later die from injuries relating to the accident. 178 others sustained varying levels of injuries, with 70 being serious. This rather tragic start to the line was only the second accident in Victoria that would lead to a passenger losing their life. It remains the only incident to occur on the group where a crew member or passenger has lost their life. However, level crossing incidents have since succeeded in casualties. This incident was almost immediately followed by another scare on the 4th, when a special from Melbourne to Lilydale nearly collided with a down service from Lilydale to Melbourne at Canterbury. The down service left Canterbury without permission, and were it not for a straight track following the station, the crews may well have not seen each other and a collision could have occurred. Fortunately, in this case, the disaster was avoided as both trains were able to stop and the down service was reversed back into Canterbury to allow the special to pass. It was mostly as a direct result of these incidents that the Victorian Railways decided to adopt the new Westinghouse air brakes. The beginning of the 1880s also marked the new era of Victorian history, namely the land boom. This period of massive investment into land developers led to an explosion in the population of Melbourne, with people moving back from the goldfields, buying up land and settling in or around the city. The eastern suburbs were no exception for this, and soon infill stations began to pop up to meet the demand. On Christmas Day 1882, only 4 weeks after the opening of the line, an additional 2 infill stations were opened between Box Hill and Ringwood, namely Blackburn Creek and Emery Hill. These stations would soon be renamed Blackburn and Mitcham. On September 1st of the next year, yet another station opened, this time between Canterbury and Box Hill at Surrey Hills. By 1884, Warrandyte had been renamed Croydon, and in 1887 a new station was opened just beyond it at Moorabark. The next stations to open were Tunstall in June 1888 and Montalbert by August 1890. In early 1885, work was completed on the reconstruction of Richmond Station, eliminating the level crossing at Swan Street and elevating the station above ground level. This also meant that the line from Flinders Street and Princes Bridge to Richmond was increased from 2 to 6 tracks, relieving congestion on the now busy junction. Duplication at Camberwell was completed soon after in May, further removing bottlenecks along the line. Also around this time, several sidings were opened, namely one at Richmond to serve a brick company and one in Mitcham to serve a tile factory. In 1888, a short 1 kilometre branch was opened south of the line at Box Hill to serve the Box Hill Brickworks. The success of the line was quickly noted and soon further extensions would be needed. The Minister for Railways, Thomas Benn, alongside Chief Railway Commissioner Richard Spate, had for the last several years been compiling and editing the largest railway construction bill ever brought to the Victorian Parliament. The bill authorised the construction of 59 new lines as well as 6 other infrastructure projects. Relevant to the Burnley Group, we have the construction of a line from Lilydale to Hillsville, the construction of a line from Ringwood to Ferntree Gully, the construction of a line from Burnley to Oakleigh, the construction of a line from Hawthorn to Kew, the construction of a line from Oakleigh to Fairfield. Alongside these new lines, the Act also provided funding for the duplication of the Lilydale line from Hawthorn to Box Hill. This massive Act, nicknamed the Octopus Act due to its far-reaching nature, passed the Victorian Parliament on December 12, 1884. Work began almost immediately on the more important lines to Kew and Hillsville. The line to Kew had been campaigned for by the region's residents for several years, however they would soon be displeased with the route the line took. They wanted the line to follow a more direct route, junctioning before Hawthorn and passing under Burwood Road in a tunnel before running along Power Street to the station site. The railways, however, seeking to avoid cost of a tunnel on a line that really didn't need it, moved the junction close to Glenferrie, meaning that the line had to make a sharp turn left to actually get to the suburb of Kew. The line was opened on December 19, 1887, with 2 stations at Barker's Road and Kew. The junction after Hawthorn was seen as highly dangerous, as the sharp curve and steep gradients meant that a train going towards the city would not be able to see the junction until they were less than 150 metres away, at which point an emergency stop would not be possible. The same was true for Lilydale trains departing Hawthorn not being able to see an incoming train from Kew until it was certain to hit them. Because of this, the signaller was distinctly told not to allow any down services from Hawthorn or up services from Glenferrie to depart whilst there was a down service past Barker Station. This dangerous arrangement could be solved by providing an extra platform at Hawthorn for Kew trains, however that was postponed by the railways until more funding was forthcoming. The next extension was from Lilydale to Hillsville. Despite starting work before the Coup line, the more complicated nature of this line led to construction taking longer. The line had several bridges along its length, most notably a massive trestle viaduct that carried the line over the Yarra River. The bridge was roughly 700 metres long, however there were embankments of built-up land breaking the total span. The line from Yarra Glen to Hillsville included a steep 1 in 40 gradient, followed by a 154 metre long tunnel, and then a 1 in 40 gradient back down on the other side. The first section of the line was from Lilydale to Yarra Flats, later known as Yarra Glen, on May 15, 1888. This was extended the rest of the way to Hillsville on the 1st of March 1889. The stations on opening were Coldstream, Yering, Yarra Flats, Tarrawarra and Hillsville. The next section to open was from Ringwood to Ferntree Gully, opening in December 1889. This line served what was, at the time, a sparsely populated region, and as such only had 3 stations serving 2 population centres. The first was Macaulay, renamed Bayswater after opening to avoid confusion with Macaulay Road Station on the Somerton line. The other 2 were Lower and Upper Ferntree Gully, both serving the town of Ferntree Gully. The line was relatively flat, with the exception of a 1 in 40 grade from Canterbury Road to Bayswater. By far, the most contentious line on the Act was the Outer Circle and Darling lines. I looked into these lines in far more detail on my Outer Circle video, however I will quickly go back over them again. Construction of both lines began in 1888, undertaken by contractor Graham and Waddick and overseen by engineer John Monash. The contract for the line stipulated that construction must be completed by September 1889, however due to numerous delays the first parts of the line wouldn't be ready until early 1890. The first section to open was the Burnley to Oakleigh line on March 24, 1890. This line branched from the main line just after Burnley, crossed the Yarra on a viaduct and roughly followed the west bank of Gardiner's Creek to Darling, where it would continue south towards the Gippsland main line, meeting the line and terminating at Oakleigh Station. On opening, stations were provided at Richmond Gardens, Hayington, North Malvern, Taronga, Gardiner, Glen Iris, Darling and Waverley Road. Interestingly, despite being constructed, Richmond Gardens Station never saw any passengers and was quickly closed. North Malvern was also soon renamed to Kooyong to avoid confusion with the station in North Melbourne. 2 months later, in May, the line from Camberwell to Waverley Road opened. This line ran south from Camberwell through the fields and over the Gardiner's Creek on a trestle bridge to Waverley Road. The stations on this section were at Prospect Hill, Hartwell and Ashburton. Prospect Hill was renamed Riversdale on opening. The final section to open was from Fairfield to Riversdale on March 24, 1891. This line ran north from Riversdale, passing under the main line and towards Fairfield. The junction allowed for trains from Camberwell to go south and trains from Fairfield to go east, but not for trains from Camberwell to go north or trains from Riversdale to go east. Road deviations and other works to allow Camberwell trains to go north were done, however tracks would never be laid. The construction from the north to the east was provided to allow timber trains from Ferntree Gully and Hillsville to ship firewood directly to the northern suburbs. However, this would never materialise as the direct route through Flinders Street was quicker and would not require the train to reverse at Collingwood. After this junction, the line would run north through several cuttings to the Yarra River, where it would cross on a large viaduct to pull it into Fairfield. It was this viaduct over the Yarra River that was the cause for most of the delays, as it took significantly longer to construct than was expected. On opening, stations were provided at Fulham Grange, Willesmere, East Coo, Deepdean and Shenley. With this opening, the 1884 Construction Act was finished. Later in the 1880s, there would be a push for more lines to further promote the land market. Some key lines investigated were extension of the Coo line to Templestowe or Warrandyte via Willesmere on the Outer Circle, construction of a line from Hartwell to Black Flats, construction of a line from Canterbury to Doncaster, construction of a line from Croydon to Launching Place or to Yarra Junction, extension of the line from Hillsville to Narberthong, and extension of the line from Upper Ferntree Gully to Gembrook. Although investigated in detail, none of these lines would come to fruition for reasons that will soon become apparent. The 1880s had seen a massive expansion of the Burnley Group, with the total length of the group jumping from just 5.4 kilometres in 1881 to 104 kilometres in 1891. This was an increase of nearly 2,000%. Another interesting stat is the amount of stations, with the same time frame jumping from 6 to 46. With the 1880s proving such a massive decade for the group, with such significant expansion, it could only be assumed that the next decade would see the same growth. As it would turn out, however, that was not to be the case. The land boom in Victoria had led to several cases of banks giving out what can only be described as insane loans, with the hopes that prices would continue to rise and said loans would eventually pay back. This system worked well until in 1888 property prices began to plateau. By 1889 the prices were falling, and as a result the entrepreneurs who had taken out these massive loans were no longer able to repay them. It wasn't long before the financial institution began to fail, with several banks closing all across Australia. It reached a peak in 1893 when 19 of the 28 banks across the country had closed their doors, with 6 never to return. The resulting loss of confidence among the people led to the second worst financial crash in Victorian history, only competing with the Great Depression. The effects of this on the railways was immense. Cost-cutting measures led to cuts and closures around the network, and the Burnley Group was no exception. An early example of this was the Rowan rail car, which by lowering the crew from 4 to 2 reduced wages and saved cost. Another act was the closure of the outer circle in parts starting in 1893. The first part to close was the northern section from Riversdale to Fairfield on April 12, 1893. This was followed in December 1895 with a section from Oakleigh to Ashburton and Darling. The final section to close was from Camberwell to Ashburton on the 1st of May 1897. Lasting just over 7 years, the outer circle was an economic failure and failed to provide any actual benefits to the railways. Back on the main line, the short branch from Box Hill to the brickworks were later closed in the 1890s due to the economic turndown. By the late 1890s, the economy in Victoria was recovering, and as such new works would soon resume. In 1891, a new siding was opened in Blackburn for the supply of bricks. The next large project was the regrading of the line from Richmond to Burnley, with the alignment being lowered below street level to remove several level crossings. Alongside this, the station at East Richmond was also rebuilt, now with a large brick building. Canterbury and Surrey Hills also received new station buildings, however these were wooden structures compared to the brick building in East Richmond. Another interesting event to occur on the group was the explosion of R279 in Ringwood, late at night on January 20th, 1894. As the engine was being picked up to leave the station, its boiler suddenly burst, sending debris flying through the air and throwing both the driver and fireman clear of the locomotive. Both men survived the incident with minor injuries, which is quite impressive considering parts of the locomotive were found hundreds of metres away, with the furthest part being 381 metres from the site of the explosion. A wooden shed nearby to the locomotive during the blast was also destroyed. As the century rolled to the close, the railways once again began looking at ways to expand their reach. In an effort to lower cost, it was decided that a select number of new lines constructed in regional areas should be built to a new 2-foot narrow gauge, reducing the corridor required and generally lowering cost. By 1895, a list of lines recommended was compiled, and by 1899, work had begun. The 2 lines relevant to us that were in this proposal were from Lilydale to Warburton and Upper Ferntree Gully to Gembrook. The decision was made shortly before construction that the gauge should be raised to 2 foot 6 inches, and that the Warburton line was to be built as a regular broad gauge line. At the turn of the century, work on both lines was underway, with the Gembrook line being completed in December 1900. This line stretched just over 30 kilometres through the shallow hills and deep forests. It was known for some rather impressive trestle bridges and for some significant curves and slopes along its length. On opening, stations were provided at Upper Ferntree Gully, Monbulk, Menzies Creek, Emerald, Devon and Gembrook. The other line from Lilydale to Warburton would open just a few months later in November 1901, measured at 39 kilometres. It branched from the Hillsville line just after the Linda Creek Bridge and curved through Lilydale on a sharp curve and up a steep grade to pass over the main street on a trestle bridge before continuing outwards. The line was provided on opening with stations at Lilydale, Alindavale, Wandon, Seville, Killara, Wooreen, Launching Place, Yarra Junction, West Warburton and Warburton. The late 19th century was a distinctive era for rolling stock in Victoria as it began to form the locomotives and carriages that would define the 20th century. By the early 1880s, the former company N and C class locomotives were quickly becoming outdated and outclassed, and it became clear that replacements would be needed. The answer to this was the Victorian Railways M class. The first of these 440 tank locomotives were built by Bayer Peacock in England in 1879. After trialling this engine, the railways ordered a further 21 engines to be built locally in the Phoenix Foundry at Ballarat. These engines were delivered from 1884 to 1886. These locomotives were built on when in 1887 the VR ordered a further 25 locomotives, this time to a new 242 tank design, designated the E-Class. In the end, 76 E-Class engines were ordered by the railways, and they would form the backbone of the railway's suburban fleet for the next 30 years. For more regional lines, the VR generally used larger, old R-Class engines. These were replaced in the late 1880s and early 1890s by the new R-Class and occasionally the Y-Class. Another engine to see use was the aforementioned Rowan rail car, a set of 2 self-propelled rail cars that were used on the outer circle prior to its closure. These rail cars experienced trouble with visibility as the cramped driver's cabinet and poorly designed windows led to practically no vision when running in reverse, and as such they were quickly retired. The final locomotive to be used in this period was the specialised NA class narrow gauge locomotive on the Gembrook line. 17 of these 262 locomotives were built by the railways in the late 19th and early 20th century, and they would be shared among all the narrow gauge lines operated by the VR. As for passenger stock, the end of the 19th century generally saw the continuation of fixed 4- or 6-wheel carriages. These cars provided adequate capacity and were flexible enough to be used all around the network. By the 1880s, bogie cars were already in extensive use throughout the VR network, and the South Suburban system was no exception, with bogie cars occasionally being used to boost capacity. One thing that must be understood about stock in this era is that carriages were still a while away from any sensible designation, and cars were generally just constructed in batches and then forced into a designation regardless of any differences. As such, I cannot really go over the specific stock used on the services, as a lack of standardisation meant it was really what was just available at the time. The 1880s and 1890s saw massive growth of the Burnley Group, with the group expanding from a single short branch line to extensive tree with several long branches. Despite a setback by the collapse of the land market, the group persisted and survived for future use. Next video will cover the settling into operations as well as the work done on the group to prepare for electrification. Thanks for watching. Just a quick outro. I want to credit the books that I used for this, which are my Outer Circle book by Beard, Allen Herbert, Victorian Railways to 1962 by Leo J. Harrigan, and Commuters, Shoppers and Scholars, History of the Lilydale Line by Mark Fidian. Also, quick, in the description, most images for this have come from either myself, my friend who's created in the description, or the Victorian Railways public railway negatives alphanumeric systems. It's just a collection of photographs by the Railways Department. Yeah, that's about all. Thank you. Also, thanks for nearly 300 subscribers. Might be 300 now. I'm not sure when I upload this. Thanks.